But first tonight, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese is under pressure to reveal whether he raised with China a serious incident in which Australian Navy divers were injured by a Chinese Navy ship. Australian divers were operating in international waters last Tuesday when a Chinese destroyer targeted them with sonar pulses. It was a deliberate and provocative attack, and it caused minor injuries to our Navy personnel. Now, this happened the day before Albanese left Australia for APEC, but the government chose to keep it secret. They only made it public when the PM was on his way home from San Francisco after his meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping. So the question is, did Albanese raise this with Xi or not? Well, the Prime Minister is refusing to say.
You've said it many times, including to me and on this program, that you don't divulge private conversations with world leaders. But given the nature of this incident, and you're copping a fair bit of flack over it, accusations you didn't raise it with the Chinese leadership in San Francisco, can you clear that up?
Well, we've raised it very clearly through all of the normal channels. We had, when I was in San Francisco, there was no bilateral meeting with President Xi where you give a readout of what the events occurred. I don't talk about private meetings on the sidelines, discussions I have with any world leader. That's how you keep communications open. But I can assure you that we raised these issues in the appropriate way and very clearly, unequivocally, and China is in there's no misunderstanding as to Australia's view on this.
So you can take from that answer that clearly Albanese personally didn't raise it with Xi Jinping. That's what it sounds like. It was raised through the normal channels, through department or ministerial level, but not by Albanese with the President of China. His response there, that he doesn't reveal what's said in private meetings. But that's not true. Just a couple of weeks ago, Albanese detailed what was said in discussions with the President when he visited Beijing. Shadow Home Affairs Minister James Paterson says it looks like the Prime Minister didn't bother to raise this with President Xi, even though he saw him just a couple of days after the incident took place.
Do you reckon Albo raised it with Xi Jinping?
I think if he had, we would have heard all about it by now, because everyone's been asking the question. This incident happened on Tuesday last week, so well before the Prime Minister got on the plane to fly to San Francisco to APEC, he would have known this happened. And he's boasted about the time that he spent with Xi Jinping and China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi while he was there. But did he raise this question? Well, he hasn't said so, and if he's not saying so, I fear the answer is he didn't.
Imagine serving in the Australian Navy, where you're prepared to risk your life to stand up for your country, and then wondering whether your Prime Minister has even the courage to verbally raise an attack on you with the Chinese president. This incident has led to serious concerns over how Albanese is managing the Australia-China relationship. The Prime Minister is fond of saying, when it comes to China, that we must cooperate where we can and disagree where we must. Well, that's all very well in theory, but this approach is untenable if it really means failing to confront problems like China targeting and injuring Australian Navy personnel. Turning a blind eye to Chinese aggression will only embolden it. The lesson to Xi will be that he can get away with treating Australia like this. He's testing the relationship, testing the strength of our sovereignty. The question needs to be asked, are we normalising relations with China, or are we setting up a new subservient relationship? The Australian Financial Review's political editor, Phil Curry, said today on Sky News that the Albanese government now has settled into what looks like a pattern of secrecy.
The whole point about restoring dialogue, in their own words, is we can now, better cope with the differences and the difficulties that are going to continue to arise. So, yes, it's just so cynical. I think it's hard to sort of, comment on it, Tom, because it's so cynical from the government's behalf. I mean, they're not renowned for their transparency. They love secrecy. And it's just become, it's almost like a game. You feel like you're being played off all the time. Clearly the instruction was don't put out the press release on the China incident until the plane's taken off. Well, what do they think people are going to say? Well, we're just not going to notice that.
Now, Phil Coorey is a straight shooter and he's a veteran of the press gallery. His comments about this lack of transparency from the Albanese government are telling. James Paterson asked today, if Albanese is going to do such extensive international travel, then he also has to stand up and advocate for Australia and our interests. If he's not going to advocate for Australia, then why is he travelling? Is it for the selfies and the trips on a luxury private plane?
But the whole purpose of this travel is that he advocates for Australia's interests, that he stands up for Australia. Now, if he met Xi Jinping and Wang Yi, the foreign minister of China, while he was in San Francisco and he didn't raise this, then frankly that is a desertion of his responsibility as our prime minister. That is an abdication of leadership.
An abdication of leadership. Now, Albanese managed to squirm and skirt around that question in his interview with Kieran Gilbert today, but at some point he is going to have to address whether he stood up for Australia's interests. He can't hide from this question forever. But let's have a look at the broader point here. Albanese is being extremely careful not to criticise China, our enemy, yet he doesn't give a second thought about publicly lecturing Israel, Australia's ally. Over the past month, we've seen Albanese boast about his 2 meetings with the Chinese dictator, when China still has trade sanctions in place on some of our beef products and on lobster and wine, and Australian writer Yang Hangjun is still wrongfully detained in prison. And China continues its hostile aggression, including sophisticated foreign interference and influence operations and intellectual property theft. Yet Albanese hasn't made any effort to personally travel to Israel to meet Netanyahu or Herzog in a show of support with a democracy where we share the same values. The bigger picture is that Albanese's performance this year has been so lacklustre that his second term in office is now looking less assured. You may expect criticism of the Prime Minister here on Sky News, at least at night time, but the political editors for all the major newspapers wrote highly critical pieces about the Prime Minister over the weekend. The Fin Review's political editor Phil Coorey wrote, and I quote, one long-time Labor figure questioned the Prime Minister's judgment in allowing the perception of detachment to fester. I no longer recognise the bloke who had his ass hanging out of his pants and who was always in touch with the punters. There are 2 views in the party, noted one insider. The first, held by sensible people, is what the F is going on. We'll finish the year and all we will have done is F'd the referendum. We're all over the place on Israel. We got pantsed on boats, all while old mates at APEC for whatever reason. The wheels are not falling off, but things are sticky. Now, that's brutal from Labor insiders to Phil Coorey. And in that excellent piece, Phil Coorey went on to say that the second view is from a cohort who console themselves with the belief that Peter Dutton is unelectable, that he's like Voldemort. But he notes that that's what Labor said about Tony Abbott, who then went on to win a 14-seat landslide. Now, News Corp's weekend political editor James Campbell was also scathing about Albanese's performance. He wrote that suddenly a question which only weeks ago seemed silly is starting to be debated seriously in Canberra. Could this government be a oncer? He writes that what has changed has been the dawning realisation, since The Voice went down, that far from distracting the government from all the other things that ought to have been talking about, the space The Voice was taking up in the national conversation was actually hiding the fact that this is a government that doesn't really have much in the way of an agenda. But now The Voice is done and dusted, there's not much sign of our Chauncey Gardner of a Prime Minister has much of an idea what he wants to do with the time he's got left in office. And then the Australian newspaper's political editor Simon Benson wrote that the political dial has begun to shift against Labor and Albanese, and that midway through Labor's first term of government, After almost a decade in the wilderness, Albanese's ambition for an extended period of Labor government already is being questioned. All the newspapers there, all scathing. As the year ends, we're in a worse position with the cost of living crisis, with both businesses and vulnerable families doing it tough. Australia has distanced itself from its ally in Israel while acting subservient to its enemy in China, and the policy debacles are coming thick and fast, from the detention scandal to high immigration numbers that are pushing up inflation. Murderers and rapists are literally roaming the streets like some sort of modern-day terrestrial version of Con Air, and the Chinese Navy is trying to cripple our sailors in international waters with sonic weapons. And all Albanese can do is pose up in some sort of Griswold family photo. The Prime Minister needs to lift his game, but it might be too little too late. The public are starting to see through Albanese. And in a magazine piece on the weekend, former Prime Minister and Labor heavyweight Paul Keating all but backed in Treasurer Jim Chalmers as the next Prime Minister.